So just to begin, for those who haven't been following the news, what are the three main concerns you have with the changes being made in this act?
Well, let me take it from the perspective of youth in particular. The first thing is the outreach and public education functions of the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada have been completely removed. And this is like unprecedented as far as we know for electoral commissions around the world not to be able to engage in general public education to try to inculcate a sense of civic duty and interest people in elections and voting and democracy generally. So that's now actually been removed and replaced by a very targeted list of the only things the Chief Electoral Officer can communicate to the public are where to vote, how to vote, etc. So that's expected to really affect youth because a lot of the programs Elections Canada is currently involved in are oriented towards high school youth, in the ages before they actually start voting, and maybe youth in their early years of voting, because we know that youth will not continue to vote if they don't vote the first couple times they have the chance. Two other things. They get rid of two methods of establishing your identity on voting day. One is vouching, which is if it turns out you cannot put together the requisite ID, and a lot of students, especially in university campus contexts, have a hard time showing their address to allow them to vote in the local riding where the university is, then the only option left for you is vouching, which is somebody who knows you, who also is an elector in that polling division, can stand and say, I know this person, I vouched for them, and certain paperwork is filled out. That's gone. And the use of, the third thing is the use of voter information cards as a second piece of ID to show your address, which was done in a massive experiment in the last election by Elections Canada. 1 million people had the chance to use that information card provided by Elections Canada. And one of the contexts in which they could use was students on university and college campuses. That has now been removed as well.
Okay.
So those are three of many things. A lot of other things that should be of concern to Canadians in general, but focusing on youth in particular, those three things are of great concern.
And one of the claims is that these cards have been collected from trash cans and distributed and such. In your opinion, is voter fraud a serious issue?
No. So there's 2 points to look at. One is there's in general social science evidence and everything that shows that voter fraud, that is people impersonating others or people voting more than once, is an almost non-existent form of fraud. The kind of fraud that exists is organized fraud that involves organizations, whether it's parties or groups that are wanting to see a certain income. And as one article I was reading last night said, the stupidest form of trying to organize mass fraud, which will actually affect the outcome of an election, is not to try to get individual voters to go up, pretend there's somebody else, only to have somebody else who's the real person find out later they've already voted and send off all the alarm bells. It's a stupid way to commit fraud, and therefore you shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't exist much. The fact that voter information cards might be dumped because in garbage cans because people either in an apartment setting don't want to vote, or the card is from somebody who lived in the apartment beforehand, is a complete red herring, because you pick up the card and it says John Brown and your name is John Jones. Well, in order for you to use John Brown's voter information card that was sent to you by Elections Canada because they thought he still lived there, you have to have a second piece of ID that shows you're John Brown. And so therefore you have to be motivated to commit fraud. You have to be motivated to go out and create a second piece of ID. So frankly, the pure idiocy of the argument coming from the Conservatives that the fact of an error rate in voter information cards means fraud is likely is completely nonsensical. It's actually in bad faith. All it means is that there's 90% of the cards are accurate, and the 10% that go to the wrong address can't be used unless you have the intention to commit fraud by creating a second piece of ID to go with you.
And how will this bill affect Elections Canada's ability to investigate cases of fraud in future elections?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Overall, it creates a kind of a fragmented structure. It takes away the major investigative officer called the Commissioner for Canada Elections, takes him out of the Elections Canada organization, where he had a symbiotic relationship with the Chief Electoral Officer, where the Chief Electoral Officer's compliance functions would help feed the Commissioner's investigative functions. He is now taken from the Officer of Parliament, which is the Chief Electoral Officer, and put into a ministry of government, the Ministry of Justice, the Attorney General, and he operates under the Director of Public Prosecution. He's a fairly independent individual, but who has to work within a ministerial environment where he's competing for budget and all this kind of stuff. And that DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, is the one who has to sign off on the budget of the commissioner who's been moved there. And lots of powers, that's an overstatement. Two powers in particular that Elections Canada had requested be granted, one to the Chief Electoral Officer, one to the Commissioner, do not appear in the bill. And one of them is for the Commissioner to be able to go to a judge and say, I need you to order these witnesses to give testimony subject to a bunch of safeguards because they're all stonewalling, refusing to testify. The evidence they give cannot be used against them. It's only meant to be for witnesses who have information about others' wrongdoing. And we know that the Conservative Party has been blocking that kind of testimony by staffers within the Conservative Party.
And one of the effects of the bill is to raise contribution limits, and I'm wondering what you think the long-term effect of more money being involved in Canadian politics will be.
Well, I mean, I think it's just one of these kind of it stands to reason points where the more you increase the donation limits, the more you give in just that little bit extra opportunity for those with more money, for those for whom a little bit of extra money is no big deal, to have an influence. Not simply because giving money to an MP or to a campaign actually causes campaigns to do things in your favor. That's not really the case. But the fact is that you can actually make it more likely that those people win, and those are the people you want to win because they share your values. And so those with wealth get to give more power to the political parties that are going to legislate or advocate in a way that they want. It also could end up completely distorting our system because there's one provision in this act that allows national parties to engage in unlimited fundraising calls to anybody who the party claims has given at least $20 in the last 5 years, to ask them to donate again. And that expense, any costs associated with that are excluded from campaign limits, and therefore you can spend to the hilt for the campaign and also spend all this extra money in fundraising, when all the calls that are engaging in fundraising will simultaneously also be the kinds of calls that encourage people to vote, that remind people of candidates, and potentially would allow people to be called who didn't necessarily even donate before, because there are no records of people who give only $20.
Okay, and just to wrap it up, can you give us an update on where this bill currently sits in Parliament?
Well, it sits in a very frustrating space. I'm sitting in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee in opposition, and we're now in something like the fifth meeting studying the bill because it went out of the plenary house after second reading to the committee. And we're hearing from witnesses who are almost all of whom suggesting amendments, only one of whom, out of dozens now, only one of whom has said he supports the bill, and I have to say he's the most inexpert witness I've come across in my 2 years here. And eventually, within 3 weeks, we'll be going to what's called clause by clause, where any amendments that are suggested are voted on. And once that happens, if any of them are accepted, a revised bill goes back to the House for third reading.
Do you think if this bill were to pass, would it be in effect for the next federal election?
Oh yeah. Yeah, pretty certain it would be.
Okay, Craig, thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.